So excited to have Dr. Tessie Bailey here with us. She is a principal consultant at the American Institute of Research, or AIR. She is also the director of both their MTSS Center at AIR as well as their Progress Center, which is promoting progress for students with disabilities. I don't know if you're not familiar with the work that comes out of those centers. I will put the websites in the chat. It's incredibly rich content and resources to really help understand these best practices in MTSS and supporting students with disabilities. So I have personally, used that resource many, many times to help my understanding of best practices in MTSS. And so I could not be more thrilled to have Dr. Bailey here in person to help us with those learnings and kind of unpack lessons learned from this field of implementation in MTSS across the country. So thank you, Dr. Bailey, for being here with us today.
All right, thanks, Eva, and thanks, Karen, for the introduction as well and setting intentions. She said something that always makes me think of this term, assume-aside. She was saying avoiding making those assumptions, and I think that is so critical, and you're going to hear that throughout a lot of my presentation today, is we have to avoid assume-aside, and we have to be very intentional about the things that we do and be clear about why we're doing those things. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the lessons learned from 20 years of implementation. I actually started as a classroom teacher. I was looking where everyone is from, but I started as a classroom teacher in Utah more than 20 years ago. And my site was actually selected as one of the initial model demonstration sites for the implementation of a tiered system of support. So I will say that we did everything wrong from the beginning. We had really good intentions, but we didn't really have the right knowledge, the right tools, or the right skills. And so we really looked at how to develop those. And since then, my life has sort of evolved over time. I moved up at the district level, moved to the state level. I moved into higher ed. And now I work for a research firm, American Institutes for Research, where we host a lot of these national centers that have or are currently funded by the U.S. Department of Education. So I'm going to share some of those lessons learned, particularly from simplification, and to make sure we're focusing on the right equation. So just a little bit about me as well. I do have two kids that both have challenges and have been supported through a tiered system of support. And so one has more behavioral needs, and the other has more academic needs. And so as I talk about my work today, I'm thinking about a tiered system of support that's looking at the collective needs of students, not just those needs that are academically related or from a behavioral side, but also those social, emotional, all of the things that come with just being a kid within a school. But I'm also going to talk about it from an educator need, because we sometimes have needs within our system that, are also social, emotional resources, leadership support. Now, two of the centers you heard about, which is the National Center the Center on MTSS, which we call the MTSS Center. It was originally the first U.S. Department of Ed funded center around a tiered system of support. And it started in 2007. And since then, we have evolved in our learning, really trying to understand the nuances between a system of support that we see at the sort of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 level, to that sort of fine-grained, maybe evidence-based approach that you take to look at a student's response to intervention, right? So we look at from the big picture for implementation all the way down to getting into SLD identification, perhaps, or trying to understand how do we intensify for a student. The Progress Center, as you heard, is around promoting progress for students with disabilities. And this is one of the newest funded centers from the U.S. Department of Ed. And it really is around ensuring that students with disabilities within the system that they're receiving their education are getting those high quality educational services, from the access to tier 1 supports to their specially designed instruction within a tiered system. We also have two other centers that I'm an advisor for, the National Center on Intensive Intervention, and I'm going to share a couple of resources from that center. That center is actually in its 12th year of funding and focuses primarily on what we might do at the Tier 3 level of support, as well as designing and implementing specially designed instruction for students who have been identified with a disability. And that last one, as well as the National Center for Systemic Improvement. Sometimes we know what we want to do, but we have a hard time getting it into place. And so this center is really focused on what are those things that we need to be doing to really implement something with a high degree of fidelity and get those effects. So you can see that I'm coming from this conversation today from a classroom teacher, a parent, as well as somebody who's looking at the overall implementation across the country. And we also work with a lot of international sites, which I think some of those sites are on today. Everything that I do, I work for a not-for-profit. And so all the center resources that will be shared in the chat today are freely available to you. And those are resources that you can use along with some of your other programs and processes. So they're meant to be for teachers. A lot of them were vetted and developed by teachers and then disseminated through our centers. So before we get started, I just want to review how we got to this tiered system of support, because I think a lot of people maybe came in midway, or maybe you've started in the last couple of years and really only have the orientation of a tiered system of support from ESSA, for example. Now, some of the early roots of a tiered system of support started way back in the 70s and 80s, where we started to look at some of these practices and the way that we would intervene with students who weren't necessarily responding to their Tier 1 supports. And if you look at some of that work, like the DIBBLES, some of you are probably very familiar with that. It came out of this idea of being able to identify those students who needed support and using ongoing data to really intensify those supports for individual students. And so you see this DBI or this DIBBLES tools start to be developed, which ultimately end up in our Reading First legislation as a way to identify students who need help in literacy and to be able to respond to those students. At the same time, there was a lot of work happening with Marzano, and I think a lot of you are probably familiar with that as well, looking at some of those characteristics of these high reliability schools. And there were these studies that were looking at things like beating the odds, like which are those schools that are really outperforming expected, and what are the characteristics of those schools so that we can then replicate those. Those became ultimately sort of the foundation for the way that we start to think about the essential components. And the first time that we really thought about this tiered level of support within education at all really came from Hill Walker's sort of article that came out in 1996 around how do we do this in behavior, right? We have this Tier 1 level of support that's meant to address the collective needs of the population. And then we have these other supports like our Tier 2 and our Tier 3 that are increasingly intense. So you have all of these things sort of churning in these different parts of the education world that ultimately come together to help us understand what is it that we need to be doing in order for us to get these results, both from an academic standpoint, but also from a behavioral standpoint. Now, we know that some of that research ultimately led to the first federally funded center that was supporting a tiered system of support. And many of you are probably familiar with the PBIS Center. It's been in existence for 25 years. It's one of the longest running centers. And its purpose was to really get us to think about this additional Tier 2 and Tier 3 system that would support those kids not receiving. Thinking a tiered system of support, the assumption was that the Tier 1 piece was already in place. And what we were adding was these additional components of instruction that would be at Tier 2 and Tier 3. Now you're probably thinking right now, well, oh my heck, we're spending a lot of attention to tier 1. But initially our thinking was that tier 1 was in place. Some kids weren't benefiting and they needed something additional. So adding on the tier 2 and tier 3 would create a much more comprehensive system of supports. You can see on the right-hand side that there are a number of schools that have been implementing, and that's been growing over the last 2 decades. But even when you look at these data, though, it's still a pretty small percentage of our population. And actually, only about 27% of schools across the country are implementing, for example, PBIS to fully to scale. Now, it's not been because of a lack of trying. So since the PBIS Center, there were a lot of other federal investments that had been happening to really help us be successful in our implementation. We had No Child Left Behind that had this reading first component that really allowed us to see some of the essential components that we associate with a tiered system of support, like screening and progress monitoring and intervention supports. And at the same time, there was another center called the National Center on Student Progress Monitoring, with the assumption that that particular component produced some of the largest effects. So we want to make sure that it gets up to scale. Now, interestingly, it is the least implemented component of most systems at the moment, even though it has been some of the largest investment that the department has made over the last 20 years. Now, following that center, there was the National Center in Response to Intervention, which I mentioned, and then the National Center on Systemic Improvement and Center on Systemic Intensive Intervention. That was really trying to help us sort of solidify this, what it is, and really how do we implement it. The National Center on Response to Intervention highlighted what were the essential components. You've seen those in guidance that come out from the U.S. Department of Ed, but it wasn't really until we got to the National Center on Intensive Intervention and the National Center on Systemic Improvement that we started to really think about, like, where are we struggling to implement those things, and what do we need to be doing to get those things implemented? So despite a lot of conversation for 10 years, it didn't really make it into the sort of general education legislation until 2015. So if MTSS seems kind of new to you, that could be why, right? Depending on your orientation, you may have thought tiered system of support's been happening for 40 years, while some of us, it might seem really new, depending on where we come in as a general ed teacher or a principal or a special ed teacher, for example. So now we have these 2 new centers, and that's where I'm going to be sharing some of the resources. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about how we got here. It was a long road. And like a lot of things that happen, sort of this bigger level, we want to make sure that we are sort of thinking that it didn't just happen overnight, right? It's like a 20-year making. So this is kind of what we see right now. And when the Every Student Succeeds Act, just a fun fact, doesn't actually use the acronym of MTSS, but it does refer to a multi-tier system of support. And it makes clear that you can use your federal dollars to be able to implement it in literacy, and which is where we see most implementation, and that it's a way that we can improve outcomes for both students with disabilities as well as English language learners. But the really cool thing about this reauthorization of the ESCA was that it required the use of evidence-based interventions at our tier 2, and then to be able to use at tier 3. And that might not seem like a big deal, but prior to this, the idea of an evidence-based intervention was really considered a term of art, right? We didn't really think about evidence-based as like a scientific term. We kind of thought about it as, well, we had some evidence, so maybe it works. But now we're sort of seeing this robust thinking around the use of evidence-based interventions. And we're much more sophisticated in what we determine as appropriate levels of evidence. We've moved beyond, well, it has a large effect size for this one group, to now we can say, gosh, this is a good match for my kids. It has appropriate dosage. It can be feasibly implemented with my setting, and there is research evidence that indicates it's likely to work. Now, on the right-hand side, what you'll see is this came from the federal center that was on the National Center in Response to Intervention, and it identified what were these 4 essential components. These are consistent across the country. You may be in a site in which you have additional components, but there has been a long-standing consensus around these big blue buckets that in order for us to be implementing a tiered system of support, we have to have some way to identify kids who need additional support. And we call that screening. We have to have some way to monitor the supports that we provide to the students to determine whether it works or not. And that's progress monitoring. And then at the very bottom, you'll see this multi-level prevention system, meaning we have to have this system of continuously intense interventions or supports to be able to help kids where they are. Now, this graphic has been around for about 15 years, and it's important in the way that it's designed. So if you look at the outside, what you see are those 3 essential components. When we first started looking at local implementation, what we found is people were actually really good at getting those 3 components in place, but they weren't really seeing the impacts of it. And so we started to really try to understand what was missing, which is where you see the center of this graphic, that without that robust database decision-making, that data literacy, the use of screening and progress monitoring data didn't really happen, right? It didn't drive instruction. And if we had instruction that wasn't really sort of founded in the data that was about our students, then we may have been providing good instruction, but it wasn't appropriate for the kids that we were working with. So there became these 4 essential components that were promoted both by the U.S. Department of Ed and through some of these national centers. Now, on the outside, you'll see some of this blue and gray, and these are some of those critical features that are necessary for implementation. And they tried to make really clear the what, and those are those 4 big buckets, and the how, right? Because we need this leadership and policy to create this context for us to be able to implement. We need good communication and collaboration. We need to have professional capacity. But those things aren't unique to MTSS, but they are essential to MTSS. So you saw in this graphic that they tried to make clear what were the essential components, how do they interact with each other, and what are those supporting mechanisms or infrastructure necessary for success. Now, just a couple of fun facts. There's not a lot of robust research around what's happening. Each state does collect some of its data, especially if it's part of a grant. But what you'll see here is that only about 28% of folks say they're actually fully implementing. And I think this is important for our own sort of mental health, is sometimes we feel everybody else has got it together and we are the ones that don't. But in reality, this has been a really difficult systems change process, right? It's not just changing your intervention or switching out your new core curriculum. It's changing the way that we think about our role, our work that we provide. How do we align all the systems, all these individual funding sources that come in? It's a pretty big deal. So the fact that we're really only seeing about 28%, and it is a small sample, but when we look across states, a small sample implementing fully, we have to say we're probably right where we need to be given our current context and our current reality. Some other things is, you're probably seeing this in your site as well, is most folks tend to be focusing on literacy. We have the most robust research in the literacy world, particularly in terms of interventions and assessment tools, followed by behavior. And that's because the PBIS Center has been funded for so long. There's been a lot of federal investment in that research. Something that is emerging, we're seeing more tiered system of supports that include math, and then social emotional learning. And then at the high school level, we're actually seeing some ways of looking at attendance, for example. Now, what I want to point out here is that one of the things that we have learned is when you start with a particular domain, you often really struggle to integrate other domains in the future. And that's because when you implement a domain, you often put all your eggs in the basket, right? You almost consume more resources than you actually have to be able to fully implement. And what happens is you often implement something that's not sustainable with other things. It's sustainable by itself, right? Because that's how it was designed, but it's not sustainable with other things. So, where we see greatest success in implementation is when we start our design with the end in mind, that students need success in reading, math, social emotional, attendance, and literacy. And then we design our system to address those collective needs, not just a particular need. So another big topic, and I'm not going to talk about it today because it could probably be like a full day conversation, but the Progress Center is working on this area, is how do students with disabilities fit? And what's really interesting is in the initial implementation, what we saw is this over focus on students with disabilities. And in fact, most people reported RTI being a special ed thing. And when we look at our schools right now, students with disabilities are technically general education students. In fact, most of those students spend more than 80% of their time or more in the general education classroom. And if you look at the overall data, 95% spend at least some portion of their day. So ultimately, when we think about kids with disabilities, they are students who are general education students first, and they also benefit from special education, and that could be delivered across those tiers. I think that was one of the things we were trying to figure out as a field is it a fourth tier? Is it just tier 3? But if you really look at the way services are designed and implemented under IDEA, technically you can have services that look like part of your tier 1, your supplementary aids and services. And for a small percentage of students who are not responding to their IEP goals, they might need tier 3 supports. But not all students with disabilities would need, for example, tier 3 supports. So what have we learned based on sort of this 20-year history and fumbling across the decades? I think the biggest thing is, gosh, we make things way complicated. One of my most favorite quotes is, life is really simple. And I think about MTSS like that as well. We want a way to identify kids who need help, give them the help, monitor whether the help works, and make changes if it's not working. That, in essence, is MTSS. But right now we have kids and teachers and schools who will say, gosh, I'm really struggling and I need some help. But we've complicated the process to get that help to students. Or we've said, gosh, we only do reading help. We don't really do math help right now. We're going to work on that next year. And so we have to really be thinking about this system and sort of what is the overall intention, right? It's going back to what Karen said. What's the overall intention of our implementation of MTSS? And are we doing it in a way that's getting the results that we want to get to? And one of the things that I think is emerging, I find this research really fascinating, is that we probably have to let a lot of stuff go. And before we start adding new interventions or new tools or new processes to implement a tiered system of support, we have to first look at what do we need to subtract, right? Because adding on more does multiple things. It reduces the quality of what we were already doing and what we're likely to implement, because we just don't have the capacity to work at 200% all the time. It also leads to higher burnout for teachers and principals. And with our national teacher shortages and sort of frustration we're seeing, it's because we're not really being thoughtful about how we approach our implementation. Right? We might be really excited around this new process we're going to put in place, but we have to step back and say, are there other processes that are not working within this system, and can we let them go? And I sort of adapted these questions from that woman who does like clean out your closet, because it kind of applies here. But we think about everything that we do within our system. And the first question we want to ask is, does this benefit the students, right? And if it doesn't, do we really need to keep it in place? Is it sustainable? And this is what happened in a lot of, thank you, Marie Kondo. Yeah. This is, the sustainability. We have a lot of good success with initial implementation. Everybody's excited. We've got everything on board. We've got our money and our resources, and we get it in place. But as a field, we really struggle to sustain. And that's because we didn't build in the fact that we can't be functioning at 150% all the time, right? And we have these other responsibilities that we have to do on a day-to-day basis. And I think that last bullet, I came into teaching, and I love kids, and I love making a difference. And I want to do things that bring me joy, that are exciting, that feel impactful, right? And so when we look at what we're doing, our current reality, what can we remove to bring in something that's going to be much more impactful, sustainable, and relevant for our population? So this gets to the equation. And I think this is our biggest learning over the last 20 years, is that if we want to make this more simplistic, we have to be clear about our design. And in that design, we have to be thinking around building something that is feasible, is acceptable to the audience that we're working with, the teachers, the parents, the students. It's likely to be impactful, and it's relevant for our context. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but I will say in the initial implementation of MTSS, and in some people calling it RTIs, people would say, well, just tell me what to do, right? It just makes it easier. You just tell me what to do. But in reality, what works in one setting is not likely to work in another setting. And so we have to understand our current reality. We have to understand the intentions of why we're implementing a tiered system of support and what we want to get from it, right? I know when I first started, we were offered free access to a published tool. And it had like 15 different screeners and progress monitoring tools. And we were like, wow, this is so cool. And I will say that we spent 3 benchmark periods testing every kid on every skill, right? Because we thought that's what we were supposed to do and what we needed to do, right? To drive instruction. But when we really sat down and looked at the data and said, what are we trying to do here? We started to recognize our design did not need to be that complicated. We only needed some basic screeners that were brief and reliable so that we could make quick decisions to move on to the instruction. Because the one thing we learned is screening a kid and progress monitoring a kid does not have any impact on student outcomes unless it changes or increases the quality of the instruction we're providing, right? Just collecting data and storing it doesn't really have an effect. It's what we do with that. So the design is really critical. So you can think about that as a 1, right? And then this middle piece is this infrastructure, is that in order for us to feasibly implement that design, we have to have this appropriate infrastructure. I'm going to share a resource a little bit later, and we'll talk about them in more detail. But there are some key things that we found that sort of facilitate success. Leaders, not surprisingly, are number 1, right? They can make or break. We've seen some of the best functioning tiered system of support completely change within a single year. New principal comes in, is not aware of what's happening or on board, completely derails everything that was happening. We also know that effective teaming, when you have poor culture and we don't really interact with each other well, or we're not confident in saying, well, heck, that didn't work, let's try something else, then we don't get this support system for the adults in the system so that they can successfully deliver to the students in the system. The same thing with professional learning. What we also found early on is there was a huge investment in initial PD. We saw this with literacy instruction with No Child Left Behind. And then once there was this assumption, right, this assume-aside that people had that knowledge, we moved on to the next thing. But surprisingly, we have new teachers every year, right? And we have a pretty high turnover right now. So if we don't have this sustainable professional learning system, we start to lose some of those skills and knowledge and understanding of what we're doing, that we sort of lose some of our effect. And I think that last one is the family and community engagement. And I think this is more critical now than probably it has ever been, but it's trying to understand that this system cannot exist on its own. Our school exists within a community, right? And it's that sort of interaction between what happens in the home, in the community, and the school that can either maximize your effects or really turn your effects on the other side, right? And then you as a school are working harder and getting effects in a short time, but then losing those effects because there's not this cohesiveness around our effect. So we can say that's a 1, too, right? So we've got a 1 times a 1. And then where we see the least amount of attention, and I'll talk about this, is implementation, right? We've seen over the last 20 years, huge investments in designing things, getting the right tools, providing professional development for our teachers, training leaders, setting up teaming structures, and then we aren't able to implement. And the lack of implementation has a lot of reasons. But the biggest one is we often design something that cannot be feasibly implemented within our context, right? We don't have enough time for it. We don't have enough staff. We don't have enough support. And so we designed something that was likely to produce huge impacts, but it wasn't realistic for our setting. And so we could only get it partially implemented. And partial implementation in some cases is worse than no implementation because it can increase negative perceptions about my worth as a teacher. Like if you're only partially doing something, then it feels like I'm not fully able to commit and get those effects. And it also can lead to these splinter skills or knowledge among students, that where we thought that 15-minute intervention was better than no intervention, we're now only giving kids portions of what they need to know and hoping it works, when in reality, it's creating greater confusion for the students. So that's where we come back to this, life is simple, but we insist on making it complicated. We have to start with the implementation in mind first. What is our current reality and what can we feasibly implement, right? What are the needs of the current needs of our site? And then backwards map about what infrastructure is needed to implement and what can we design to get to those levels of effect. And I'll share some tools and strategies for that. So I'm going to break this down by those 3 buckets. And you can see if there was a 0 on any of those, it's a 0 effect, right? And that's where we're working harder, but we're not really getting the results that we want. And that can lead to a lot of frustration, right? And then people saying, I'm going to go somewhere else, or I got to do something else. But when we feel successful, we are more likely to be fully committed to what's happening. So some things that we've learned is that we have often focused on the wrong questions with MTSS. And I didn't put them in here because I didn't want you to think about them too much. But the wrong questions are things like, how do we get our kids better on state tests? Which intervention should we purchase? What's wrong with that kid? Or what's wrong with that teacher or that school? It's where we focus on these really narrow things that we think we can fix. And the root cause analysis has kind of led to some of this, and we need to be a little bit more careful because sometimes we get to something we think is the problem, and then we devote all of our resource and attention to fixing that problem, when in reality, we probably could have made a change at the bigger level and prevented the problem, right? So instead of fixing, we're preventing. So a way to prevent some of that getting off track or, overworking is to think about the right questions. So the first one is, what do we want for our kids, our educators, and our schools? It seems like a really silly question, but what we've found is it is often based on assumptions. I assume you have the same beliefs as me, right? I want my kids to be able to be, great in the post-school world, but your assumption is I want the kid to be able to read better. And this other person's assumption or belief is I just want the kid to stop acting crazy in my class, right? And so if we all come to the table and we're trying to design something, I'm thinking about post-school outcomes, you're thinking about literacy success, and you're thinking about, oh my heck, how do we just control this behavior? We're not going to really get to some consensus around the design, right? Because we're focusing on different things. So my recommendation to you as you go back to your sites is really just come to some consensus and say, what do we want? And what we've found when we ask these questions is probably a lot different than the models we're designing. And if you think about to yourself is, what do you want for the kids in your school? A lot of people say things like, I want them to be happy. I want them to feel safe. I want them to make friends and be ready for the post-school world, right? When we think about that as the outcome, we start to think differently about how we design our system, right? Because if we're only thinking, I just want the kids to read better, then we will design a system that gets the kids to read better. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to help their social emotional well-being, their math skills, their behavior skills, or to be able to make friends, right? So we need to be clear about what's the intention with our comprehensive tiered support. The other thing, and this one's a little tricky for people, is we have to be honest about our current reality. Sometimes we want so badly for something to be there that we sort of talk about it as if it is already happening. And we have to think about our current reality is not a negative reflection on us, but just what it is. It's what we're dealt, right? We have X number of teachers. We have this schedule. These are the students that we have within our school. These are our resources. Because when we take into our account our current reality, we start to design things that are more relevant and feasible within our setting, right? So we think about what we want. We be honest about what is our current reality. That includes our own skills and knowledge and beliefs, right? Then we say, what do our kids need to get from this current reality, their individual performance, our system performance, to what we want for our students? And that helps us identify where we need to go versus somebody telling us or reading a book and saying, well, that sounds pretty cool, we should do that. But instead saying, we are the experts of our own setting. We understand our resources. We know our students. We care the most about our kids. And where we want them to be is not where they are. And this is where they are. And we're going to move them from here to there. Then we can start talking about what is a tiered system of support. And I say this because when we provided PD early on, what we often did was people would say, well, tell me how to do screening. Tell me how to do progress monitoring. Tell me how to do this. And that's what we would show people how to do. And then that's what they would do. But it's not necessarily what their kids needed at that time. We didn't really take into account the current reality. So what would happen is it was really hard to implement, and it never really got to full implementation. So keep those in mind. And we're going to put a resource in the chat box. And a way to think about this is an acronym that our National Center on Systemic Improvement came up with, which is FAIR, right? We're looking to design a system that is fair, select practices and procedures that are fair, that are feasible within our setting, that are acceptable. This is where we get into that buy-in, right, with our stakeholders, our teachers, and I will say acceptable to our students. We see the greatest disengagement at secondary levels because we implement practices that kids don't find accessible or acceptable. And as a result, they don't fully benefit from them. We're working hard, we're blaming kids, and kids are like, why are you doing that? I don't really need that, or I don't understand it. So that acceptability is that we are looking across all of our stakeholders. Obviously, we want to do impact, and I would like to put that word first, but it didn't really work with the acronym, right? It'd be IFAR. So this idea of putting impact third doesn't mean that's the sequence that we think about. We honestly have to start with the extent to which what we're going to do is going to produce an effect. And what's super interesting is some of our greatest effects are the things that require the least amount of effort. So if you look, for example, at high leverage practices or some of the evidence-based practices, they're very teacher dependent. They don't require a lot of bells and whistles, but they produce really large effects. And so that's where we want to be focusing on what's the impact. And I think that last part too is the relevance. What is the relevance of this practice, this procedure, this whatever we're going to do for our particular setting? Whether it's, is there impact of doing this with a similar type of school? Does it meet the needs of our particular students? Right? We have that flexibility within a tiered system of support, which is what makes it so awesome, but also what makes it sometimes feel so overwhelming, because we start to doubt our own capacity to make those decisions, even though we have the knowledge and skills to be able to do that. And the best thing to do is just ask. Ask your educators, ask your students, ask your families, so that they're all getting on the same page about understanding, is this going to be fair for our setting? And I will just say, after 20 years or so, there's no evidence-based practice that works in every situation with every student. I will say we spent billions of dollars trying to find that and really trying to understand it. So you are the ones that know your context, your capacity, and your need. And by being really honest about those, it allows you to select practices that are likely going to be implemented with a high degree of fidelity and produce some of those large effects. So I'm going to share some resources, or I'm not, but we're going to put some resources in the chat box that can really help sort of facilitate some of this thinking. I will say that in order for us to really be able to implement in design, we need to articulate what we're going to implement. I think if we assume everybody knows what's happening, that's how you get to assume-a-side, the most deadly part of education. But if we write these things down, and if we can't write them down, then what it means is the other educators in our system are also not going to know what's happening. So there are some sample resources, and these are free. They were developed by teachers for teachers. You can take these, they're Word documents, and adapt them for your own setting. But the idea of being able to implement something you've designed means you can define the parameters of that thing, right? Because without being able to define the parameters or the procedures or when things happen, we often hope things happen, but we don't have any evidence that they happened. And we want to have a large amount of confidence that says, we did what we needed to do, and this kid did not respond as expected. So now I'm confidently thinking about what I'll do next. We see a lot of paralysis by perfection in the field, particularly at the tier 2, tier 3 decision-making level, where people really want to get to some level of perfection. They collect all the data that they can have, and they're like, but I'm not sure. And it's that not sure that prevents us from acting. We are professionals. We have been trained. We go through our programs. We know and care about our students. We have to be confident in our decisions. To be honest, we won't make the right decisions sometimes, but that's why we have procedures in place that say, well, we tried this. This was the effect. It didn't work as expected. We're now going to change it and try the next thing. And ultimately, that's at the sort of foundation of response to intervention, right? It's giving us this flexibility to try something, measure the response, and then make the next decision. And these tools right here is, you see this, there's a hypothesis development on that link that's there that helps you if you're like, I just don't know what's happening right now. I don't know why the kid's not getting it. There are some scaffolded supports for adults so they can make better decisions. There is this intervention intensification checklist, right? Sometimes we don't know what to do. Like, the kids' needs are so unique. It gives us some guidance and some scaffolding to make a decision, because not doing anything in some cases, the effect's going to be the same, but at least trying something allows us to determine what is the effect. And then we can say, well, gosh, it doesn't seem like the kid needs this. It seems like they might need this. So let's try that and see what happens. And so there is the National Center on Intensive Intervention. Susan, it's up a little bit higher. Maureen posted it at 12:57. Those are the links to those tools. And she's going to post as well this other resource around the National Center on Intensive Intervention. And this is one of those validated processes that we see at Tier 3. I will say one of the biggest ahas that we had in the last 15 years is you can't really purchase Tier 3. And that's because by definition, it's individualized instruction for the student. And that wouldn't mean that the publisher would have to know every student in your school to be able to individualize it. So what happens is there is this promotion of the validated intervention. That's your standard protocol, your Tier 2 intervention that you would do for a group of students. And then at Tier 3, for those students who are not responding based on your data, we would use those tools that we just saw on the other slide to be able to say, what does this kid need that's different than these other kids? And sometimes he still needs that same intervention, but he needs a little bit of extra help, right? And it could be there's increased opportunities for practice in Tier 1. Maybe he gets more practice opportunities within the Tier 2 intervention. It could be that he needs to be taught transfer strategies, right, that are unique to that student. And so this is one of those validated processes, an evidence-based practice that allows us to implement intensive intervention at Tier 3. Some of you older teachers like myself, you probably recognize this as like precision teaching, but it's allowing us to sort of meet the needs of most kids who have supplemental supports. That's through that top orange box. And then have a process for those 3 to 5% of students who aren't responding as expected, right? And it allows us to quickly make those decisions for students so that we can increase their overall trajectory to the outcome. So that's that design piece. And there's a lot of other cool things. And I didn't put them all in here because heck, we could sit here for days. But for example, the National Center on Intensive Intervention has tool charts, which are like consumer charts for selecting progress monitoring tools and screening tools and interventions. Like, all of those tools exist. But if you don't have this understanding first about what you want for your kids, what's your current reality, those tools can be misused. And so that's why I focus this part of the session on really making sure we know what we need. So when we go to those resources, they're much more useful and relevant for us. And there's some like free like videos on there to show you how to use them, but you can always contact us and we can walk you through it. So I want to talk about infrastructure because this was a really hard lesson learned about why we weren't getting the effects, right? Because on paper, I will say that, gosh, the number of MTSS guidance documents that we saw and we reviewed and we're like, wow, these are stellar. They align with the evidence base. They look awesome. They have all the essential components based on the research, but they just weren't getting the effects, right? And so there was this missing piece, and it wasn't for lack of trying to implement, but it just wasn't sustaining. So there is a center called the CESIP Center, which is really looking at implementation science and education. And some of you may be familiar with NERN, which is the Network of Implementation Research National Center on Implementation Network or something, but it really looks at the research around infrastructure and support mechanisms. Super fascinating and really relevant for our success, not just with the tiered system of support, but literally with anything that we do in education. And I think this bigger thing right here, this infrastructure needs to be set in place, not only for the initial implementation, but also to sustain implementation. And we often don't think big picture. We're like building the plane as we're flying type mentality. We have a short-term funds. We're trying to do things really quickly. But there's this saying, it comes out of some of my Georgia colleagues, is you got to go slow to go fast. And if you slow it down at the beginning and take a little thought to say, what's needed now to get this up and running, and what are we going to need long term to make sure it stays, we set ourselves up for a greater level of success. So this resource I'll put in the chat box. It's a free resource that's available, and it really highlights some of those infrastructure and support mechanisms that we have found are essential for long-term implementation. Without that essential infrastructure, what you see is your work is short-lived, right? And I'm sure you've heard that, we go from one side to the other side, right? And this is often what happens. And so we want to make sure that before we even think about implementation and while we're thinking about our design, what is our essential infrastructure and support mechanisms? So for example, you might be training your district staff or training your school administrators, and you're doing all of that training before you ever implement. You're looking at how your personnel's, what's the role they're going to take, right? Are you using a distributed model, or does the principal serve in a different role in this model versus what we were previously doing? In the lower right-hand corner, you will see schedules. It has been probably a point in contention, particularly at the secondary level, is how do we schedule more intervention time? To me, that's one of the wrong questions, because what happens is if that's the question we ask, we focus all our efforts in trying to find more minutes in the day, and they don't exist, right? We have to step back and say, what do we want for our kids, right? What is our current reality? Our schedule is structured in this way, and what do our kids need? And if it comes to some agreement that our kids need more practice opportunities, there are feasible ways to do that within an existing schedule. I don't have the link for it, but I will share it. But if you search on the National Center on Intensive Intervention, there's a resource that a colleague and I put together around scheduling. And it's ways in which we can intensify within our existing intervention structure, intervention block, the way that we can utilize our tier 1 to increase some of those practice opportunities. Because it's not that kids need more time, right? I think we've been conditioned to think tier 2 is 30 minutes, tier 3 is 45. They have to be a certain number of minutes. Those minutes are sort of like an infrastructure component, but ultimately what they need is more practice opportunities. Kids who struggle need about 10 to 30 more practice opportunities than a kid who's on target, right? So if you think about the intent is that I need to provide more practice opportunities, it allows us to be more flexible and creative. And how do we get those practice opportunities? Can I increase the way I elicit response and provide feedback within my intervention block I have? Can I create more practice opportunities within my tier 1? Can I maximize things like transition time or homework time to be able to provide those practice opportunities that kids need to really accelerate learning? I will say this, and it's probably no surprise to everybody, but changing adult behavior is really hard. It's probably why 20 years passed when we first, started thinking about this as a tiered system of support. We're still working on it, but it's because the way that the system in the US is set up is everybody's trained by different people. They then come to a school that may have completely different training, right? So if you think about a teacher, you probably have as much splinter knowledge as some of the students that you're working with. So this idea of training and coaching is so essential. And I will say the National Center on Systemic Improvement has demonstrated this time and time again. Those schools that have really robust initial and long-term professional learning for educators that is supplemented with coaching have much greater effects. In order for us to achieve collective efficacy, we have to feel successful. And what we know is that when we try to do a bunch at once, we often feel overwhelmed and really unsuccessful. So when we start small and do things that are feasible, acceptable, impactful, even though they're really tiny, we start to build our confidence. And that's that go slow to go fast that we'll start to say, all right, I'm ready for this. We can get this done. And then you'll start to see this exponential implementation. And some other things is be patient. It takes a little bit of time. These are some data out of 2 different states here, is that we look at implementation fidelity, and this is just on paper, right? We see this, that districts can really get to a full level of fidelity in about 2 years. The schools within a district, we get about 80%. We'll always have some late adopters. But what really makes the impact, what changes student performance is this piece. Because if teachers aren't implementing those practices with a high degree of fidelity, even though the district and the school has put in all the infrastructure, got the tools, if teachers aren't able to implement those, then we're not going to get our effects. And then it feels like we're working really hard, but not getting the impact that we would like to get to. So think about, what are you feasibly trying to get implemented, and what is a realistic timeline for your schools? So I'll just close up here, and then I'll open it for comments, and I'll say, where do we go from here? I will say, just maintain a focus on your students. What do you want for your kids, right? And if you start to hear things like safe and healthy and happy and engaged, then you have to then look at the system you're designing to make sure that it's facilitating those things. And I would just caution about being overly focused on getting the process to a high degree of fidelity if the process is not relevant for your students. Keep your focus on those right questions. What do you want for your kids? And I think this process, and we've seen it successfully done in multiple states, applies to your educators. You can have tiered support for your educators, and we know that districts and states are providing those tiered supports for schools. So what do you want for those stakeholders? What is your current reality, and what do they need? Then you can start your conversation about, what does our MTSS system need to look like? Thank you all.
Thank you everyone for participation and paying. So again, thank you so much, Tessie. This was fantastic.
Thank you guys. Enjoy the rest of your day.